Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Chancellor for that statement. So here we are, the end of 2022. 3 Prime Ministers, 4 Chancellors, and 4 budgets later. And where do we find ourselves? In a worse place than we started the year. Inflation spiralling, growth plunging, living standards falling. Mr. Speaker, Britain is a great country with fantastic strengths. But because of this government's mistakes, we are being held back. What people will be asking themselves at the next election is this: are me and my family better off with a Conservative government? And the answer is no. The mess we are in is the result of 12 weeks of Conservative chaos, but also 12 years of Conservative economic failure. Growth dismal, investment down, wages squeezed, public services crumbling. And what does the Chancellor have to offer today? More of the same, with working people paying the price for his failure. The Chancellor should have come here today to ask for forgiveness. At the very least, he could have offered an apology. But no, instead he says that his predecessor was correct in his analysis at the mini-budget, the mini-budget that put our economy into freefall. All the country got today was an invoice for the economic carnage that this government has created. Never again can the Conservatives be seen as the party of economic competence. Now, it's been clear for weeks what they wanted to do. Step 1, blame global factors. Step 2, pretend the mini-budget is nothing to do with any of them. Step 3, portray the Chancellor and Prime Minister as the people who can clear up the mess of their party's own making. And step 4, attempt to lay some so-called traps for the Labour Party. They've even had George Osborne in to advise them on how to party like it's 2010. But, Mr. Speaker, this isn't a game. This is about people's lives. This is about people's livelihoods. It's about their ability to pay the mortgage, their ability to pay the rent, and the ability to pay the bills after 12 years of Conservative stagnation that has left our country so much worse off. It's about the fact that when the global storm hits, we are uniquely exposed because of the choices that the Conservatives have made. Now, Mr. Speaker, nobody doubts that the COVID pandemic and war in Ukraine have had profound implications. And the whole House is united in its condemnation of Russia's aggression. But Britain's problems started before the COVID pandemic, and they started before Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. The UK has grown by an average of 1.4% a year under the Conservatives, compared to 2.1% a year in the Labour years before that. We are the only G7 economy that is still poorer than before the pandemic. As the Governor of the Bank of England told the Treasury Select Committee yesterday, the US has grown by 4.2% since the pandemic. The GDP of Eurozone countries is 2.1% higher. And yet the UK is 0.7% smaller than at the start of the pandemic. We aren't recovering. We are heading into recession, as the OBR has confirmed today. Now, the Governor described these differences as dramatic and as stark. How does the Chancellor describe them? And how does he explain them? This is the price of a decade of Tory choices and economic failure. And it is set to continue, with the IMF forecasting that out of the 38 most industrialised economies, the UK will have the slowest growth of any of them in the next 2 years. Now, the Chancellor is saying today that he will be honest. So let's be honest. No one was talking about cuts to public spending 2 months ago, and no other advanced economy is cutting spending or increasing taxes on working people as they head into recession. This government has forced our economy into a doom loop, where low growth leads to higher taxes, lower investment and squeezed wages, with a running down of public services, all of which hits economic growth again. And instead of learning from the mistakes of the last decade, they're simply repeating them. We need to break free from this vicious cycle of stagnation with fairer choices and a proper plan for economic growth. Now, the Chancellor and Prime Minister are trying to convince us that Britain faces problems that are nothing to do with them, that the mini-budget, which imposed a Tory mortgage premium, put pensions in peril and trashed our reputation around the world, was all just a bad dream. It's their Bobby Ewing strategy. Downing Street as Dallas. Old cast members return as if nothing had happened, with tangled plot lines to keep the audience. But the truth is, it has lost all credibility. And everyone knows it is long past time that this series was cancelled. And the problem for the British people is this. This is not a dream. This is the everyday nightmare of Tory Britain. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives would have us believe that they are not responsible for the last 12 years of failure. In doing so, they take the British people for fools. Millions are already worried sick about how to make ends meet and are now facing the added stress of higher mortgage payments. The prospect of home ownership becoming more and more remote, and rents going through the roof. What does this mean? Family holidays cancelled, savings depleted, hopes for the future replaced by sleepless nights. And all of this on top of the fact that the average worker is earning less today than when the Tories came to power 12 years ago. The government has presided over the biggest wage squeeze in centuries. This was a crisis made in Downing Street, and it is ordinary working people who are paying the price. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I was coming into Westminster today, I read a timely warning from the police about pickpockets in the area. They warn, you may have an idea of what a pickpocket looks like, but they're far less likely to stand out in a crowd than you think. They may work in teams to try and distract the target. And one of their tactics is where a thief will appear to be over-friendly while pickpocketing you. Now, I must report that in the last hour, the Conservatives have picked the pockets of purses and wallets of the entire country as the Chancellor has deployed a raft of stealth taxes, taking billions of pounds from ordinary working people. A Conservative double whammy that sees frozen tax thresholds and double-digit inflation erode the real value of people's wages. Just one of those freezes in the personal allowance will cost an average earner more than £600, make it even harder to make ends meet. At the same time, the government is forcing local councils to put up council tax. Now, the Chancellor seems to have confirmed today a council tax bombshell worth £100 for a typical Band D property, taking their council tax above £2,000 for the first time. Local people, including those with Conservative councils, will be forced to pay more because of the destruction that the Conservatives have wreaked on our economy. And this at a time when councils are already in dire straits because of cuts by Conservative governments. Now, they probably sat around the tables in Downing Street thinking that this was some clever trick. But no one is to blame except the government that's been in power for 12 years, not local authorities, but this Tory government. More taxes, more inflation, higher mortgages. And instead of tricks and stealth taxes, why don't they have a proper economic plan for Britain that puts working people at their heart? And why do they refuse to have a real industrial strategy that gives business certainty, unlocks investment, and means that Britain can once again lead the world in the industries of the future. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor is trying to claim that this statement today is fair. Yet we learn that of all the things that he could save from the wreckage of the kamikaze budget that he chooses to press ahead with is their plan to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. At a time when he's urging wage restraint for everybody else, how can he remotely claim that this is fair? And after weeks of will he, won't he, we learn today that the Chancellor won't, after all, be clapping down on non-doms. Tax-free income for millionaires while millions face frozen tax allowances and council tax high. How can he possibly claim that this is fair? He refuses to act, and I wonder why. Maybe that was the only policy that he can't get signed off by number 10 Downing Street. I say, if you make your Britain your home, you should pay your taxes here. And what about the private equity managers earning millions who benefit from a tax break on their bonuses, which mean that they pay far less tax as a proportion of their incomes than ordinary hard-working people? Did the Chancellor close that loophole today and make sure that they pay their fair share of tax? He did not. He made ordinary working people pay the price instead. Because, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, we've seen how quick the Conservatives are to raise taxes on working people. Now, the Chancellor has even compared himself to Scrooge. He's asking working people to take the hit, with less money in their pockets in the run-up to Christmas, but also for years to come. But if you're a banker, a non-dom, or a private equity manager, don't worry. Scrooge hasn't cancelled your Christmas. And that's before we even get onto the energy giants. After months of resistance, well, the Honourable Lady says from a sedentary what about taxes? Well, the non-doms don't pay taxes. That is the whole point, and that is why the Chancellor should have closed that loophole today. And this is before we even get on to the energy giants. Really? They don't pay taxes. And that's before we even get on to the energy giants. After months of resistance from this Prime Minister, the government has finally been dragged kicking and screaming to extend the windfall tax that Labour have been calling for since January. Yet they still leave billions of pounds on the table. Profits that are the windfalls of war. Because they have failed to close a huge loophole that they created that hands out massive tax breaks to those oil and gas giants for doing the things that they were going to do anyway. For those wondering why, some energy giants have paid no windfall tax in the last quarter, despite record profits and eye-watering bills for consumers. The answer is the decisions that this Prime Minister made when he was Chancellor, confirmed by the current Chancellor, lets the energy giants off the hook once again. Mr. Speaker, the government has announced plans for energy bills next year, but bill payers will still see prices go up next spring, leaving far too many people wondering how they'll make ends meet. For every pound of windfall tax left on the table, people are faced with higher prices on their bills. And the Tories' failure on energy goes back much further. They closed down gas storage, blocked onshore wind and solar, and slashed support for home insulation. Now, today the Chancellor says that he will act on energy efficiency, but I'm afraid it's all far too late. We called for the insulation of 2 million homes a year more than 12 months ago that could cut bills by £1,000, not just for 1 year, but for every year to come. And they did nothing. Insulation levels in 2021 were 20 times lower than in 2010 because of their neglect. And now he proposes a package, but we have to wait until 2025 for them to act. Why? When people are facing a bills crisis now, years and years will have gone by. While he sits back, millions of families could have been helped, and they have not been. And still they block renewable power, like onshore wind, that could bring energy bills down, create good jobs in all parts of the country, and ensure that Britain can lead the way in the industries of the future. Clean power is the right solution to the energy price crisis, but yet again the Conservatives have failed. They have failed to protect us from future shocks, failed to tackle the cost of living crisis, and failed to take the decisions in our country's national interest. It is because they have failed to grow the economy that they are having to bring forward yet another statement with tax rises and spending cuts. The last Prime Minister and Chancellor embarked on a reckless sugar rush that abandoned fiscal rectitude, and they all cheered for it. But the current Prime Minister and Chancellor have given up on growth altogether. And how do we know? Because the Office of Budget Responsibility has seen their plans, and they've downgraded growth in the months and years ahead. Achieving the levels of growth this country needs isn't like flicking on a switch. No. We need a serious long-term plan to get our economy growing again, powered by the talents and efforts of millions of ordinary working people and thousands of businesses. We need a fairer, greener, more dynamic economy, creating good jobs in every part of the country, in homegrown renewables, in green hydrogen, in carbon capture and storage, with Labour's Green Prosperity Plan, with a modern industrial strategy where government works hand in hand with business, properly fixing business rates so that small businesses and our high street businesses thrive again, and fixing the holes in the government's Brexit deal to help UK businesses trade and compete in the world, and ensuring that Britain is the best place to start and grow a business. That is what a Labour government will do. Mr. Speaker, while our public services are struggling and working people are being stretched, the rampant waste and cronyism from this government continues apace. It does not seem to concern the Chancellor that his government dished out £3.5 billion of contracts to friends and donors of the Conservative Party. And the latest Prime Minister spent so much time when he was Chancellor practising his signature for his glossy Instagram graphics that he failed to put in place even the most simple checks on COVID support. That is why the former Treasury Minister, Lord Agnew, described the current Prime Minister's fraud failures as schoolboy errors. The Prime Minister left the doors to the vaults wide open to organised criminals and drugs gangs. They helped themselves to £6.7 billion of taxpayers' money, money that the government is failing to retrieve. And last month it was slipped out that the Taxpayer Protection Task Force set up to get this money back is being wound down. The government's just given up, and the Conservatives are turning yet again to our crucial public services to make up the money. Mr. Speaker, the fraudsters may think that they have got away with it, but a Labour government will hunt them down for everything that they have taken from the taxpayer. The country is sick of being ripped off by the Tories. We want our money back. Because of Tory failure, our crumbling public services are set to suffer even more. Ordinary people lose yet again. Never before have people paid so much in tax and yet got so little in return. At the weekend, the Chancellor admitted that the NHS was already on the brink of collapse. With 7 million people on NHS waiting lists, how much longer will that list get? 3 in 10 people are leaving education without GCSE English and maths. What will this do to our society and our future economy? And why do the Tories have an ideological objection to putting VAT on school fees, which the Chancellor himself admits will raise £1.7 billion? By their actions, it is clear. The government does not value our public services or the contribution of those working in them. And what do we hear today? Reviews on schools and the NHS workforce, on social care and on waste. But what we need is action. The time for delivery is now, not time for more reviews. And now we hear from the Chancellor, who had previously said that one of his biggest regrets as Health Secretary was failing to fix social care. And today he has further delayed the government's much-promised social care cap. This is yet another broken promise after 12 years of Tory failure on social care. The Tories have trashed our public services, and the statement today is proof that they are doing nothing to turn that around. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have crashed our economy, given up on growth, and sent inflation through the roof. And as usual, it is ordinary working people who are paying the price. It is a familiar tune. Every mortgage they raise, every cut they make, every tax they hike, the Conservatives are costing you. And what have we heard today? Yet more excuses and unfair choices. They have failed to tackle the cost of living crisis. They have failed to show how they will fix our public services. They have failed to show how they will deliver growth. And they have no plan for the future of our country. And everything we have heard today, and after 12 long years of Tory failure, the conclusion that we must come to is that Britain can no longer afford a Conservative government.
Right. Let me start with the Chair of the Select Committee, Harriet Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Bond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we've announced tax rises and spending cuts of £55 billion. We can debate the reasons, but to govern is to choose. And she didn't answer the simplest of questions. Does she back the need for a package of this size to bring down inflation? If Labour can't answer, they are not fit to govern. She says it's the government's fault. But with a made-in-Russia recession, a once-in-a-century pandemic, higher inflation in Europe, bigger cuts to growth in Germany, bigger interest rate hikes in America, to blame this on a mini-budget that was cancelled in 3 weeks is just not credible. Nor, Mr. Speaker, are her facts right. She said the government is making the recession worse. Well, today, the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility says we are making it shallower, saving 70,000 jobs. She says this is austerity 2.0. But in the 2010 Parliament, spending fell about 3% a year. In this Parliament, even in the next 2 years, it will rise 3% a year. £11 billion for the NHS and schools is not just more for our public services, it's massively more than she has ever promised. And then she talked about our record over 12 years. So let's do that. Growth higher than Germany, France, Italy or Japan. Lowest unemployment for nearly 50 years. Good or outstanding schools up by a quarter. 4 million more patients in good or outstanding hospitals. In other words, growth up, employment up, school standards up, NHS funding up. And because she won't back this package, the British people today know that under Labour, it's inflation worse, cost of living worse, unemployment worse, competitiveness worse. If we want stability, growth and funding for public services, the choice is plan or no plan. We have a plan. Where's hers?